Hey, welcome to Conversations. I'm John Thomas. This is my friend Josh Hoffert. Josh actually helps to oversee our Streams Canada branch. So if you are Canadian, you may or may not have heard it. If you haven't, you can look up Streams Canada and see we're doing a lot of courses up in Canada, especially over the last couple of years and this coming year. But Josh has been studying a little bit about the Desert Fathers, and we've had some amazing conversations over the last few years. And so I thought, why not just bring you guys into the conversation, because there's so much richness that's in the Desert Fathers. It's interesting. We teach the Streams courses, Art of Hearing God, Understanding Dreams and Visions. And at the beginning, there's this letter that John Paul wrote about the reasoning behind those courses and making them available. And one of them was how God was bringing back the riches of the Desert Fathers and helping people to discover some of the things that they had. And I find that just so interesting, because there's this thought sometimes like of progress, like we're beyond where people were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But the reality is, in a lot of ways, we're really behind.
Yeah, that's true. I remember teaching with you one time, and you had said you always read that introductory letter to the courses every time you taught. And I thought, every time I teach, I seem like I skip over the introductory letter to get to that. And then I started reading it, and I realized, my goodness, the Desert Fathers is right in there, the wisdom of the ancient prophets and the Desert Fathers. And it's true that the more I study them and the more I read them and all of that kind of stuff and write about them, is the more I realize that we're so far behind where we used to be, is what it seems like.
Yeah.
And I remember reading one Desert Father recently, and he said that I can't even love the one who loves me unconditionally more than I love myself. And I go, oh my goodness, I'm not even there. I'm not there. I don't think we're there. And the wisdom that they walked in, it just, every time I read it, I'm just so struck. Convicted, struck, inspired, all those kind of things. Yeah, we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's amazing how many like prophetic and spiritual encounters, prophetic experiences, visions that they had, and the wisdom that they had about that. There was this depth that was to it. And one of the things specifically I thought would be just really helpful is just thinking about some of the wisdom they had in discerning prophetic experiences. Is they talked a lot about how to recognize when you're having a vision or an encounter by the soul versus by the spirit, which is not something that you hear a whole bunch about. I mean, in the last few years, there's been some good teachings that have come up, but it's kind of a new subject in many ways, but it's really an old one.
Yeah, and it's so true, because they talk about it all the time. It's full of spiritual experiences. The amount of stuff they talk about when it comes to prophetic gifts and things like that. Like one of the first Desert Fathers, the first guy was St. Anthony the Great. And he basically said that he always struggled with pride because he knew how much God had gifted him. And he'd look at other Desert Fathers that were so humble, and he'd go, you're so much more humble than I am, because I have to struggle with pride because I have a great gift. And because I have a great gift, I have to constantly find ways of embracing humility. And you're like, man, the way that they approach those kind of things. Yeah. I'm one guy, he was talking about this experience he had. And he had seen, it was kind of some dark vision of some kind. I can't remember all of the details, but he's looking at it and he goes, I know this isn't a vision from God because my natural human faculties are still working. He says, when a true vision from God comes, it overrides my ability to think. And I'm drawn up into the vision of God. And all of that, like the pride that goes along with, did I have a great vision? Is this? So one of the ways I've looked at some of the Desert Fathers' teaching when I'm ministering prophetically, I pay attention to, are my thoughts going to pride? Will I be received from this word or that kind of stuff? Or am I just, I love this person because Jesus loves them? And looking at those kind of things has been really helpful. Going, a true vision from God overrides my human faculties and draws me into his love because it's him, it's not me anymore. And the way they talk about some of that stuff, discerning what kind of thoughts you have. I mean, it's almost like the entirety of their practice was to still the inner life so they could hear God.
Yeah.
It was the whole
Yeah.
thing, because they wanted, and without that stillness, without that interior peace, they'd go, we have so many competing voices. So that they organized everything, like fasting. Fasting wasn't geared to just fast. Fasting was geared to quiet the inside voice, quiet the desires and all the things that your heart rages after and wants and lusts after and all of that kind of stuff. So they'd fast in order to deal with that voice, so the voice would calm down so they could hear God. It was the whole point, was being in silence before him. It's like the whole spirit, almost the wholeness, the whole totality of the spiritual life to them was geared towards hearing him.
Yeah.
And
That's so good.
so they look at things like Matthew 5, blessed are the pure at heart, for they shall see God. And they go, what do I need to do to purify my heart before God so I can see him? Because I want to see him purely.
Yeah.
And if I don't have purity at heart, if I've got these competing things happening in my heart, then I won't be able to see him purely. So I've got to deal with this in order to see it purely. So everything revolved around that, is cultivating that interior space so they can hear and see God perfectly. And recognizing, of course, the whole time that it would never be perfect, but they would do everything they could to cultivate that space to be able to see it and hear it. And that was I think that was probably their discerning between soul and spirit, was, I've got to prepare this guy first, my heart first. Yeah. And as I prepare that, I'm drawn into this great experience of God and can see and discern between those two things.
Yeah. You know, there's a phrase that struck me. You had me come up to Canada to teach a little course on prayer in Calgary area.
Yep.
And when I was preparing for that, I went back to another message on prayer that I did where I really felt like the Lord spoke this phrase into my heart and kind of arose out of me. So, you know, I say that with some hesitation,
sure.
But I feel like it really was the Lord. And the phrase was this: the result of a well-prayed life is an interior reality that does not resist the presence of God.
Yeah, so good.
The result of a well-prayed life is an interior reality that doesn't resist the presence of God. Now that understanding, it completely changes the way that we approach prayer. I mean, when I hear some of their stories on prayer and their teachings on prayer, a lot of their prayers was not trying to figure out how to get God to do things. They were figuring out how to submit themselves to the will of God, not to get God to submit to their will.
Yeah.
And that is a huge difference, because I've heard so many teachings on prayer that are really about how to manipulate God's will to our will.
Right.
Versus bringing our will into submission to God's will.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was the whole purpose of discipline, was to deal with the will. And really, one of the things I've been thinking about lately is, if you really think about the human life, like, you don't choose when you're born. You don't choose. Most of us would choose a different body to be born into, but you don't choose the makeup of your hair or anything like that, or your family, anything. You don't choose anything. The only thing you have in life is your choice of how to respond. Your will really is what it boils down to, is what am I going to choose? And we talk about that in the Art of Hearing God, right? The moment of choice, and what you sow into spirit or you sow into soul. And the Desert Fathers, it was all about how you choose to respond. Are you going to choose to respond in love, or are you going to choose to respond in another way, spirit or soul?
Right.
And there's for instance, there's a guy who was a disciple of Anthony the Great. So one of the early guys, his name was Paul the Simple. I love it that he was known as the Simple. He was known as not really knowing anything. And one time he was chastised by Anthony because he didn't understand theology very well, because he was known as the simple man. But there's this fantastic story where he's standing in front of the church building as all of the people are coming into the congregation to gather to worship and all of that stuff. And it says he's glorifying God because he sees all the light and the angels and all that kind of stuff that are ministering to these people that are coming in, and he's going, oh, this is so beautiful. And then one guy comes and he says that, you know, the old language is he was besought with darkness and attacked by demons or something like that. And he just starts weeping and weeping and weeping for this guy. And to the point where he removes himself from the service because he's so distracting to everybody there. And it says he stands on a rock outside while the whole service is going on, weeping before God on behalf of this man, because he's seen just the state of what's going on. And then the service ends and everybody's walking out, and they see Paul the Simple outside, and they're going, what's going on with Paul? Why is he, like, he's crazy. He's just weeping and lamenting. And Paul's watching everybody comes out as he's weeping and interceding before God. And he sees the guy come out that was besought by darkness and attacked by demons. And he sees him full of light now. And he stops instantly and he points out the guy, because he didn't want to expose the darkness in the guy, right? So he points out the guy and he says, this is the guy. I saw him when he came in, he was full of darkness, but now he's full of light. And the guy tells them that at the words of Isaiah 1, though your sins are as scarlet, though I'll make them white as snow. So he hears the reading in church. He has an encounter with Christ. He repents and turns his life around in the service as Paul's interceding for him.
Wow.
Like, what? And I'm going,
that's so beautiful.
It is, because he's so moved by revelation to intercede based on love.
Yes.
Like, how many times, I know I've done this.
Dude, say that again.
He's moved by revelation to intercede. He's moved by love, or the revelation moves him to love to intercede for the man.
So
as opposed
good.
to move to
So
judgment. I remember one time, this happened in my own life. There was this guy, I found out that he'd passed away, and I remember every time I'd see this guy, I'd always go, he's dealing with some issue. I could just tell just by looking. I got the revelation. I could look at him, he's dealing with some issue. Mm-hmm. And then he passed away, and I see this memorial on Facebook for him, because Facebook becomes the memorial for the person, and everybody's remembering this particular person, and how beautiful he was, and how much they loved him, and everything. And I'm thinking to myself, what? But he was so messed up. I knew every time I saw him, I had this revelation. I knew he was messed up. And then this one guy posts on Facebook, and he was this New Age guy that I knew, and he posted, and I'd been talking to this New Age guy and trying to kind of introduce him to Jesus and things like that, and he knew I was a Christian, and we'd have these good conversations, but I never really had any headway with him. And then he posts on Facebook, I just heard this guy passed away. And I'm thinking, how did he know this person? Because this person, they wouldn't have been in the same circles. And he says that they were out hiking one day, or he was out hiking one day, ran into him, and they stopped and chatted for a couple of hours. And he says, and he really convinced me that I promised him I'd read the Gospel of John, because he said I needed to read that because there's something about Jesus I needed to understand. And now I'm going to go do that because I was really challenged by him. And I'm going, that's what I've been trying to do the whole time. And I never could get across to him. Yeah. And I realized in that moment that I had judged the guy based on what I called revelation as opposed to loved him. And when I read Paul the Simple, I went, oh my goodness, that's the true heart of prophetic ministry, is being moved by love. And I was sitting in front of my computer reading the Facebook posts crying, because I'm going, I couldn't even be bothered to pray for the guy. And I thought I had revelation, but I couldn't even bother to pray for him. Yeah. I realized that was just my soul responding to his soul. That wasn't revelation. That was just me. Yeah. Because again, true revelation, like the one guy says, is that his spirit overcomes you, and you're moved by his love. And that's what happened with Paul the Simple. I love that. So it convicted me.
I mean, you go, there's so many things we could go just with that idea, but the whole thing of the fruit of revelation. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we talk about revelation, and this is one of the main themes I feel like we desperately need to get. Yeah. I mean, we need to get as a prophetic movement, is the way to recognize what's prophetic is not by the accuracy.
Yes.
Because you could be absolutely accurate and astoundingly accurate and completely miss it.
Yeah. It's true.
And not be the Spirit of God at all. Yeah. Because the devil's accurate.
Right.
So what's the fruit of it?
Yeah.
What does it actually do in our heart? Does it move us to love, to joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control? Yeah. Does it move? Because when Jesus is talking, Matthew 7, we'll go just a little bit further in that, in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, talking about false prophets, you're going to recognize them by the fruit.
Right.
You're not going to recognize them by their gifts.
That's right.
Because many are going to come to me in that day and say, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do all these mighty miracles? Yeah, you did all that, but you never knew me.
Right.
You didn't actually bear fruit. It's not about the supernatural activity in and of itself. It's the spirit that it comes from, and what was the fruit that it bore? Was it loving?
Yeah.
And I love Bob Jones' story when he went to heaven in the 70s.
Right.
He died, and
Right.
he's up in heaven, and he's in the judgment line.
Mm-hmm.
And he's watching as these people come before the Father, and the Father asked them one question: did you learn to love?
Mm-hmm.
Did you learn to love?
Yeah.
And,
Wow.
and Bob realizes that he can't lie.
Mm-hmm.
In that place, it was impossible. And
Right,
so
exactly.
he gets before the throne. Did you learn to love? And he goes, no, God, I want to, but I never learned how to love. He says, I'm going to send you back so you can learn how to love.
Right.
And that's what I remember, because Bob died on Valentine's Day,
Right.
February 14th. And I'm
Right.
like, he learned how to love.
Yeah.
He learned how to love.
Yeah.
Now, if we could just get that one thing,
Right.
how do we make it not so much about the accuracy, though we have to be accurate, about the activity?
Yeah.
How do we make it about the person of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, and that's, that is, I've been thinking more and more, and the more I've done prophetic training and the more I've taught these courses, and just, I'm still pretty young, but been teaching the courses for five years and serving in ministry for 10. And the more I see, the more I realize my cry, for a long time it was, I want more accuracy and I want better revelation. God, we need more, it's almost like the more power, the vineyard days, right? More power, more revelation, more accuracy. Yeah. And then now I've been starting to realize that if I don't have love, then I can't carry the revelation of the accuracy, because without love, I'll ruin the person, or I'll hurt the person.
Right.
And so I'm starting to see 1 Corinthians 13, especially verse 1. I can know all mysteries. I can have all knowledge. I can have all revelation. If I have not love, I'm nothing. So my cry has become, God, give me wisdom and love. I want wisdom and love. And then revelation and accuracy will come. Give me wisdom and love, so that when it's revealed to me, I can actually love the person.
Yeah.
And I asked a prophetic class I was training recently, if God revealed to you the greatest sin of the person in front of you, could you still love them? And our typical Christian answer is, oh, well, of course I could. Well, what if they molested children? What if they were a serial rapist? And you saw that, God revealed that to you. Could you still love them? I said, until we get to that point where we can still love them, we will kill them based on their accuracy as opposed to love them towards Christ. Yeah. And so my cry more is not more power. It's like the more power, more authority thing that John Paul used to talk about, right? It's not more revelation, it's more love. Yeah. If I have more love, then revelation can come naturally, because I love the person and I'm going to help the person. I was just thinking about the great prayer Paul prays in Ephesians 1. He says, may the eyes of your heart, or the eyes of your understanding, be enlightened, that you would know the glorious inheritance of the saints, that you would know the exceeding greatness of his power, and you would know the greatness of his calling, paraphrasing it. But those three things, he says, the eyes of your understanding will be enlightened. So enlightenment of your heart comes when you see him as bigger, because it's his calling, it's his glory, and it's his inheritance.
Yes.
It's about seeing Jesus. And the greater I see him, the more my heart is full of his light, and the more love I have for the people, and the greater accuracy. Then I'll know what to do with the accuracy and the revelation. Right. But I need the love first. Yeah. So anyway, that's been my...
And what happens is accuracy impresses people, but love changes people.
That's so good. Yeah.
And that's what we need to get, because we're not here to impress people. We're here to change people. We want people to have a real encounter with a real God, where they actually become different, where they don't think of us differently. I mean, whether they do or whether they not. I mean, I don't know how many times I've prayed that people would forget who I was, but they would remember the Lord.
Yeah, that's so good.
That I would go and I would be able to minister, but that when I left, that they wouldn't be like, man, that guy was amazing, but they'd be like, man, God is amazing.
Yeah.
That's the cry, and That's the cry. I mean, the Desert Fathers, you read
Yeah.
story after story after story. And the ones that had these astounding giftings, I mean, they had miracles and deliverance and all this. I mean, I can't remember who it was, but one of the guys, somebody came to him and Father, please pray that I be delivered of a demon. And but he was afraid that they would recognize that he had prayed and they would be delivered of the demon. And so instead he gives them something. I think it was a piece of fruit or something, and says, or a piece of bread, and says, go eat this as you go and ask God to deliver you. And so they, as soon as they took a bite, they get instantly delivered and instantly set free. Right. And they come back, and he's like, no, that wasn't me.
It was
that
the fruit or the bread.
It was God. That was.
I love that.
But once we get to that place of actually carrying the character of Christ enough, we can be in that place. And,
it's true.
Learn that we're representing Him. We're not representing our ministries. We're representing Him. We're not representing our gifting.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's one of the great lessons.
I think
Fathers.
There's a story that's told of Macarius the Great. He's one of my favorites. I love Macarius the Great. It's one of the early ones, discipled by Anthony the Great, and he's in the 4th century. So early church, right? First 300 years of church. And it says that, some of them are fanciful retellings, or they embellish certain things. So you just have to wade through some of that. So, but in this particular story, it captures the principle anyway. It says he is in his place doing his disciplines, all that kind of stuff, and he sees the devil walk by, and he says, "Hey, where are you going?" And it says the devil says, "I'm going down to the monks in the lower area of the desert to go tempt them." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And so then he carries on. And a couple of days later, it says, devil coming back, and he says, "How did it go?" And the devil says, "Well, everybody resisted me except for this one guy. I really got through to him. And so I had a great time with him." And so Macarius goes, okay. So then it says Macarius packs his stuff up. He goes down to the lower desert, and he goes and finds the monk. And he sits down with him, and he asks him, "Hey, how's it going?" And the guy says, "Oh, it's going great. I'm so good." It's your typical Sunday morning response, right? Yeah. "How's it going?" "It's good." And the guy says, "It's good. It's going so great." And Macarius goes, "Oh, that's so good to hear. I've been struggling with sexual sin." And he hasn't. But he identifies with the guy. And the guy goes, "Oh, it's so good to hear you say that. I've been struggling with that myself." And Macarius says, "Okay, it's going to be okay. Pray a little bit more, fast a little bit more. God will take care of you." And he leaves. And he never tells the guy that I wasn't actually struggling with that.
Right.
It wasn't important to him to be thought of as a great person. He was okay being known as a failure. So he goes back, and then a couple days later, he sees the devil coming again to go tempt the guy. And when the devil comes back and he says, "What happened?" The devil says, "It was terrible. He resisted me at every single turn. I tried to get under his skin and do all the stuff I did, but it didn't work anymore," because Macarius had gone through and loved him without being concerned about what he looked like.
Yeah.
There's another guy. It says that he won families by selling himself into servitude, and he would keep the money, and over time win the family to Christ as their indentured servant. And eventually all of them would become these incredible God-loving people because he served them so well. And one family in particular that the story starts with, he gives them back the money after like 2 years of serving them.
Wow.
And he gives them back the money. They said, "We can't take this." And he said, "No, I won't be paid for what I did for you." It's like, and so they said, "Well, we can't take the money now too because we don't want it." So they distribute it to the poor, and he goes and sells himself to the next family as a slave to win them to Christ.
Yeah.
It was like, man, the stories of absolute commitment to loving people because they were struck by the love of Christ.
Loving people, loving God.
Exactly.
That's what it all comes down to.
It
loving people and loving God. And if you actually do that well, you'll never have a drought of supernatural experiences that last long.
Yeah, that's right.
But you also won't end up having the supernatural experiences that lead you into error.
Right, yeah, that's good.
And if we make it about love, we can be safe. But if we make it about the supernatural experiences, we'll never be safe.
Yeah.
And that's really the key. We've got to make it about love. We've got to make it about Jesus. We've got to come back down to what's the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And upon these two, all the law
That's right.
and all the prophets depend.
Huge statement.
That's everything. Hey,
Yeah.
thanks for joining us for this conversation. We hope that you're inspired to love more and to go after God, because there's so much more available, but it's found on the other side of seeking Him and His heart. And as we do that, you'll never run out of encounters. So bless you guys. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So good.
Yeah.
Yay.